Hi, everyone. As you have noticed, I have not been online as often as I would like to be. Between work and home life and other commitments, there just does not seem to be enough hours in the day to do what I would like to do. I'm sure you can relate. And along with being busy, I have found myself just engrossed in a topic that has really sparked my interest. And so I wanted to make this video as a prologue about the topic that we as society largely ignore. So sit back, relax, get yourself something to drink, something to snack on, and I will tell you about an article that I had read that will tie everything in very nicely. This particular article is about a young man named Jacob. Jacob grew up in the Midwest, and he could never imagine that he would experience domestic violence. He said he was a straight white guy in a normal small town that he thought catered to people like himself. He said that his family was very close, his parents were still together, and there were no big family problems that would have given him some kind of window into how dark the world could be. Yet Jacob spent several years in such darkness after falling in love with a young woman by the name of Courtney, a woman that he had met online. Courtney was a year older than Jacob, and from the start, he was enchanted by her presence online. She was pretty, but more than that, she found him funny and engaging. And, like any young man would do, Jacob made a play to meet Courtney in person. They had lived a few hours apart from each other, and he was very disappointed when she declined. But a year later, she had emailed him out of the blue and explained that she had just gotten out of a relationship and asked if he wanted to get together. And of course, being a man, he ran at the opportunity. He said it was an adventure to get to know her because she lived far away. Now keep in mind, he was 22 years old. He was somewhat of a rudderless college graduate. He wanted to do big things, but he wasn't sure what that looked like. So instead, he poured his energies into nurturing a relationship with Courtney. She was charming and funny, but he also saw that she had a vulnerable side. He thought that he could help her. Perhaps he could be her knight in shining armor. And the long-distance relationship progressed rather quickly. But from the beginning, he had seen signs of volatility. But he always found a way to write them off, even when they involved her episodes of drinking too much and passing out. He said, I would always put it back on myself and say, hey, you're a guy who's not good with emotions and feelings. You are dumb, you're a dunce, and she just knows more about feelings. Now, it was easy for Jacob to look back now and see the trajectory of emotional and verbal abuse that led to physical battering. But at the time, Courtney's behavior and words convinced him that the problem was his alone. She was emotionally volatile, and from the beginning, she exhibited extreme mood swings. But Jacob was sure that as a man, he just did not understand women's emotions. He says today that a relationship like that warps your thinking. He says, I took every mood swing at face value and trusted it, took it seriously, and was willing to believe that I was the cause of it. He knew he was in too deep, but he also was uncertain about how to turn back. And instead of running away from her, he proposed to Courtney. And it was not long before the physical abuse started. One of the first episodes of battering occurred when the couple was preparing their wedding invitations. Now, I have to tell you, if somebody starts slapping me around when I'm writing out invitations, that's when I would have said adios. Courtney was drinking more frequently, and she also was becoming increasingly violent. This is when Jacob should have ran. Now, while working on the invitations, she was sneaking away and getting drunk. And when she returned, she'd slap and punch him. And then she actually got on top of him and started choking him. He said that he tried to postpone the engagement, but Courtney became hysterical at the suggestion. And he said that she was on her hands and knees, apologizing while holding his wrists very tightly, making a big show of being sorry. And unfortunately, it worked. And a few months later, they were married. Now, Jacob still did not accept the fact that he was a victim of domestic violence, mainly because it never occurred to him that a man could be abused by a woman. Now, even though women are 3 times more likely to be killed or seriously injured by a male partner, up to 29% of straight men in the United States have been the victim of physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. And even more, up to 48%, have experienced psychological and emotional abuse at the hands of their partners. I want you to remember that, please. Each year, more than 830,000 men are victims of domestic abuse. That's 1 every 37.8 seconds. Now, Jacob says that he tried to be the good guy and to do the right thing. Because Courtney was manipulating him emotionally and verbally, he was willing to believe that he was the one with the problem. He felt compelled to help her with her emotional instability. He believed that if he could be good enough, that he could help put things together and help manage this very unmanageable person. Now, no one in their circle of family and friends knew that Jacob was already being abused by his wife. He had alienated his friends by throwing himself into the relationship with Courtney, and he worked hard to conceal her behavior from them, even when she ended up in a psychiatric hospital for a brief episode of inpatient treatment. She continued the verbal and emotional abuse, and the physical violence persisted. Jacob said that they would fight for hours at a stretch, ending only when they both were exhausted. And she would go on and on and on and beat him down until he was on his knees crying and apologizing, and he didn't even know why. Now, Jacob's social ties were effectively cut, and so he was all alone. And he knew his marriage wasn't healthy, but he continued to feel the weight of responsibility. I was very focused on being an upright guy, he said. In time, though, he couldn't write off her attacks. Physically cut off from everyone else in his life, he used an email to slowly reveal his abuse to his one and only remaining friend and the pastor at his church. But even then, I was using this coded language, like she's strong-willed, she has emotional outbursts, things are tough, she's moody. The idea of being abused was one that he still had not articulated, which is not uncommon for men who struggle to reconcile domestic abuse with ideas about their masculinity. Jacob says the terrifying tipping point came when Courtney had discovered his emails and confronted him. He said she was just devastated. I had talked about her, and it was like telling tales out of school or something. And he said this was an atom bomb in their relationship, and he felt guilty for hurting her so deeply. He said, I felt as though I had committed a grave sin. Talking about these awful experiences was breaking the code of silence around the relationship. So, in the logic of this relationship, she had the right to be broken and to be devastated. It wasn't until Jacob's parents intervened that he had articulated that he was being abused. One weekend, when he and Courtney were supposed to go home for his brother's birthday, Jacob called his parents to say that she would not be joining him. He continued to shoulder the blame, saying that he had thought that his marriage was in trouble and that he had done something terrible. But his parents broke through the defense. His dad even asked him, has she ever hit you? And he said, I'm not going to answer that. That's what started it. To hear my parents' voices, these two people who loved me and had good heads on their shoulders, somehow made a light bulb come on for him. It was then that he realized that he had to get out of the relationship. He knew that she would not change, and it was no longer his responsibility to help her change. And it was the first moment that he realized that he was in an abusive relationship. But he said the recognition of the abuse did not eliminate the barriers to leaving the marriage. Jacob was not confident that he could get out of the house safely, and he had to make an escape plan with the help of his family. Their divorce took more than a year to finalize, and Jacob had to get a restraining order to prevent Courtney from contacting him. She had shown up at his workplace and snuck into the basement of the home that they had lived in. Even when that was behind him, the effects of the abuse rippled across the rest of his life. These days, Jacob is in therapy, where he's working to unpack the past so it doesn't repeat itself. He says, I don't live in fear that I'm going to be hit again, but I have a lot of work to do on myself. What's the trauma and what's just the way I am? I'm conflict avoidant. I have a concern about big shows of emotion, unstructured, out of control emotions. I had to learn about barriers and how to talk about my own interior life without fear. He relies heavily on family and friends today after reconnecting after being isolated from them during his marriage. So the reason I felt this article was very important in what I'd like to think is my research into domestic abuse is I believe we saw a lot of this in the Watts case. I think that Chris Watts was an abused man. I believe that. And I believe that he became the type of man like Jacob, believing that everything that went wrong was his fault, and that he did not know how to handle certain situations because Shanann told him that he did not. I'm going to continue with this, but I'd like to hear your comments as of right now, and then we'll continue to go further.